In the suburb of Al Zahur, just east of Amman, Palestinian refugees line up at this UN-run clinic to receive medication for diabetes and heart disease. The newer, more advanced drugs are still imported from afar from the likes of Merck and Novartis, but the UN also turns to local Jordan firms to stretch the dollar.
The drugs that we buy, about 25% of them are coming from manufacturers within Jordan, and that's for distribution throughout our region of operations. If we don't need a Mercedes, we don't buy a Mercedes. If all we need is a Chevrolet and we can find a Chevrolet price, we buy a lower price.
Family-owned Ram Pharma supplies a large chunk of what the UN buys, but admittedly makes mostly Chevrolets, older off-patent generic drugs. Generics are a low-margin, high-volume business, but making your living off cheap drugs may be coming to an end. The name of the game now is licensing. In 2000, Jordan joined the WTO and soon after signed a free trade agreement with the U.S., taking both seriously. It now rigorously applies international patent laws, which require local drug makers to pay a fee to produce drugs invented by others. That pushed up cost. To sweeten the pill, it gave the industry tax breaks on raw ingredients. In 5 years, revenue from drug exports alone have nearly doubled from $125 to $226 million. Jordan firms now export 70% of what they produce, the highest in the Mideast. Hikma is one of those. It exports 52% of its products to the U.S. Their vice chairman told me that it covers the cost of licensing by selling high-value, recognizable drugs to America. It's the same drug, but cheaper because of Jordanian labor.
Licensing costs are much higher than the generic, definitely, and the companies that you work, they have to look at the rule of law. This is very important, and Jordan has the first-class rule of law. The U.S. market is the biggest pharmaceutical market worldwide. The generic industry in the U.S. is growing double digits every year. So the trend worldwide is the generic pharma is the key for the future for healthcare expenditure and cutting costs and providing higher quality products.
A long-time licensee, Hikma exports 52% of its branded generics to the U.S., the world's biggest market, because its version of the same drug is made with lower labor costs. The firm sells 113 generics in 34 countries, 25 under license. Back in the 80s and 90s, Jordanian drug firms focused primarily on developing generic products for the Arab market. And if a company were to spend money licensing a cutting-edge drug, oftentimes they'd find a competitor would have a similar product illegally on the market a few months later. But with the new protection regime in place, a company can no longer survive by just copying. So the emphasis now is developing niche products and investing in R&D. Arab companies invest less than 1% of its profits into R&D versus the 12 to 18% invested by multinationals. Triumph Pharma is a Jordanian startup which believes in research. It has found a new way to get someone's patented drug into the bloodstream more quickly and owns the patent to the modification. This is called drug delivery. It now shares joint patents for the technique with GlaxoSmithKline and Merck.
The patent for the drug delivery is the same as for the active, which lasts around 18 to 20 years. So your revenue stream from licensing fees will basically last for at least 10 to 15 years. So the real hard work is actually in the beginning.
Patenting drug delivery techniques is one way Jordan's firms can spend millions rather than billions for their own niche, high-margin products. Developing new drugs costs millions, but paying for licenses and more research has pushed up production costs. Jordan has 17 local pharmaceutical companies. The executives I spoke to say many will be forced to merge or go out of business.
The Jordan industry as a whole would come into mergers and would end up into 3 companies only or 4 companies maybe. You need to merge in order to have more expenditure on marketing and on research.
With the cost of production set to escalate, profits will likely be enjoyed by the few companies who know how to navigate the rules of free trade to produce brand name drugs that are recognized worldwide and at home, where emphasis will be placed on high-value drugs instead of cheap generics.